The following video contains opinions that are my own and do not reflect that of the United States Navy or the Department of Defense. These views are my own. A few short words in a short letter sent January 1st, 1802, changed the course of political discourse centuries after it was penned. President Thomas Jefferson, responding to the plight of persecuted Baptists in Connecticut, described a, quote, wall of separation between church and state, which was erected to protect believers of various denominations. Ironically, moderns have interpreted and applied this phrase against the church, turning the wall into a cell. This same Jefferson helped pass Sabbath laws in Virginia and owned slaves. He sure wasn't an egalitarian, as secularists would lead us to believe. Even the more open-minded, like Jefferson, could not conceive of the kind of godless society that modern America became. They sought instead to establish a Pan Protestant political order. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, most states had state churches of various denominations and traditions. A kind of lesser Christendom existed across the states without the stricter senses of sectarianism that were experienced in Europe, but clearly things did not work out perfectly. Inefficiency and apostasy disestablished this lesser Christendom before and around the time of the war between the states, but the cultural expectations remained. Decades after, Christian unity was a prerogative. Prayer was in schools, many children were still learning to read from the King James, and the Christian flag emerged as a symbol of unity. All these things happened irrespective of denominations. The world after the Second World War seemingly became set on destroying even these cultural practices and assumptions, bringing us to today's disposition. But Christians are fighting back. As believers across traditions in recent years have become biblically literate, politically self-conscious, and historically minded, the tides have been turning in our favor. By God's grace, true repentance will set us on a better path, informed by the old ways. But when we get there, what will the new Protestant order look like? What can we learn from the past and change for the future? This is the Politica Christiana podcast, where Christian politics are understood, analyzed, and applied.
There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Politica Christiana. I am your host, C.G. Billiot. The show is brought to you by the Battle and the Bride blog, and this is the season finale, folks. It's been a good ride, but we are joined today by the good doctor himself, the Christian Prince, Stephen Wolfe, a scholar of Wolfshire, North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and 4 children. Recently finished a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University, the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He is the host of The Lone Bulwark, co-host again of Ars Politica, and has written for a number of publications, including Mere Orthodoxy, First Things, and American Reformer. He is the famous or infamous, depending on how you see it, author of The Case for Christian Nationalism. So we are very honored. We are very stoked to have Stephen with us. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. Doing great. I just finished up another episode of Lone Bulwark. So, yeah, I messed up the first time, and I was smoking a cigar because I didn't have enough data on my camera. And so I was like, well, so I went down somewhere else. I got a new battery. I got, new data or whatever they're called, SD thing. And smoke a second cigar. So I'm on my second right now. But I can't smoke inside, unfortunately, so sorry.
Well, smoke them if you got them. You do have the window cracked, so really It's all about how brave you are. But
right there, so I can't really do that sort of thing right
That's right. The cigars
not yet. Yeah.
The cigars are really just symbolic of what you're doing to Twitter right now, setting things ablaze you're setting the social dogma ablaze, apparently.
Yeah.
well, today, folks,
it's really important because you have to understand why It's how you analyze like social phenomena. Is it you find, especially in discourse, you find the ways that people will engage certain groups differently. And
Yeah.
whenever there's difference, so like if you're doing natural science or you're doing like social science, you find difference in the data, you want to explain that data. And sometimes there's
Right.
no good explanation, and sometimes there's good explanation. So if someone's going to engage like, my crowd and use denunciatory language and nasty terms and all that sort of thing. Yeah, but when they engage like the transgenders or they engage the left and they're engaging differently, well, there's a difference. And so what explains the difference? And so that's why I think it's so important. It's a sort of social critique, but it's as old as, ancient Greece. So
Right.
it's
Right. Well,
it's
and we're
political theory. Well, it's just stupid. So, but yeah.
right. And we're going to continue to challenge a lot of those notions in today's episode, which was largely inspired from the last chapter of your book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, right before that fiery epilogue, the What Now epilogue, in which you essentially recount the Pan Protestant Order of Old America, which you begin that chapter even identifying the fact that even secular pagan historians, they have to acknowledge the fact that the Christian heritage is there, and yet you have to work harder to convince other Christians of that, interestingly enough. So could you describe for us, I know this is something you've written about, you've spoken about at conferences, can you describe the Pan-Protestant order of the founding era, from that era up until the time of the Civil War, how that was exhibited in laws, customs, and events? And as the cold open mentioned, what lessons can be learned from the Danbury Baptist case study?
Yeah,
I apologize, that was a lot,
I
but
could talk for an hour on that. Well, let me start from the beginning. So in 500 BC, no,
all right,
no.
Putin.
So I won't go there. But yeah, I think in order to understand the founding, you actually have to go back to. I mean, go back as far as you want, but you have to understand the Puritan New England and kind of correct some misconceptions of that. So there are famous cases in Puritan New England, particularly in Boston, as usually people highlight those incidents where you have you have the so-called persecution of the Baptists, the Anabaptists, the Quakers, and the Antinomians. And so they use that as to talk about how these guys wanted to create a sort of heaven on earth, and just they chased after any sort of heretic they could find and burned them at the stake, and all that stuff is sensational, and of course it's false. But even the Puritans back then, they saw their fellow Baptists as brothers in Christ. The and this is true because the Congregationalists came to New England to create a colony for themselves, and that's why they were there. And now they're going to do it in the Congregationalist way. So really, Presbyterians weren't really welcome. I mean, they were kind of welcome, but Baptists show up and they want to start their own churches, and they look around and say, you guys aren't true churches because your notion of baptism is wrong. And so there was a fear about the social order. They still said, okay, we disagree on baptism, and yet you guys are still brothers in Christ. You can be in our church. That is the Congregationalists, like John Cotton was saying, things like that. And there were actually many Baptists in the Congregationalist churches. So, but they were interested in establishing a Congregationalist colony, okay? But they weren't so exclusive that they thought that everyone else was a false Christian. Now, this is very important because in Protestantism, your faith is an internal thing. It's fundamentally your belonging to Christ's kingdom is a matter of inward faith. It's not institutional alignment. This was affirmed across the board among Protestants. From Presbyterians affirmed it, Anglicans affirmed it, Baptists affirmed it, Continental Reformed affirmed it, even some of the Lutherans affirmed it. And so it was across the board this sort of thing where you're in Christ's kingdom by faith, and it's not a matter of institutional alignment. You can distinguish that from the Roman Catholics who affirm that very explicitly. So the point being is that Protestants in principle can recognize true brotherhood amongst people who are in different institutional alignments or even theological alignments. I apologize if the dog's barking at a bird in the sky, or a chicken going off. But anyway, or a kid screaming. I don't know if you guys are
all blessings.
I might have to shut the door.
you're
Kids
good.
got home from school. But anyway, there's a point to this, and that is that even early on, there's a recognition of that fundamental principle of religious freedom rooted in a Protestantism. So it was a theological foundation to it, that we could have, in principle, possibly a pan-Protestant order And actually, many of the fellow Congregationalists in England at the time, such as like Thomas Goodwin, John Owen, had actually moved that direction because they were in England during the English Civil War and suffered persecution. They banded together with all sorts of different Protestants to fight the king and establish their order for a brief period of time. But in New England, they're like, we're Congregationalists and we're going to keep it this way, even though we call. So everyone was kind of in agreement on that. But as time went on and various historical events occurred, even in New England, they started to loosen up a bit. You have in 1717 or so, you have Cotton Mather, who's the son of Increase Mather, giving the ordination sermon at a Baptist church in Boston, First Baptist Church of Boston or something like that. And that's a pretty significant event. So you have Congregationalists who are Paedo-Baptists now helping ordain a Baptist minister in Boston, pretty significant. And so you see a progression of this Protestant principle through experience expanding over time. So that's why I emphasize that it's a very Protestant thing. It's not merely Christian, it's not a mere Christian idea, because Roman Catholics, religious liberty is not, that had to come from the outside. Like it had to be a papal, dicta pretty much there had to be that in order to establish, which happened in the 1960s. So they're a little late. But anyway, so then you get to the American founding period, and there's a sort of culmination of that Protestant experience. Now, most people affirm a type of religious liberty. There's very few people who didn't. And plus you have different states with different denominational alignments or with the majorities. So Anglicanism in Virginia, you have Congregationals in New England, you have Quakers and some others in Pennsylvania and so on. And so there was a spirit of religious liberty, but it wasn't unprincipled. It was a Protestant development. And this created, I think, and so in this way you can, even though there's no we're in founding documents, doesn't say we're Protestant, doesn't say Christ, doesn't say Christianity. Nevertheless, I think when you read the religious liberty of the founding period and beyond, you have to read it as a culmination of Protestant experience over several hundred years. So it's not like, it's John Locke said it, and he's an Enlightenment figure, and he's a philosopher, and so let's say it was John Locke's business, It was like an Enlightenment thing where it's a universal thing. They just used reason and they came to this thing. There's some of that. But there's also, I think, mainly just Protestants who are very committed to their faith and what we'd consider conservative, who realize that, we can live with the Baptists.
Right.
Or, you know what I mean? So,
right. So in other words, this wasn't, whether it was with the early colonial days or the founding era, this wasn't some cosmopolitan, pluralistic ideal of we're going to let anything religiously fly. It was oriented around Christianity and disparate groups of Christianity. Do you think also, and this is kind of a bonus question, but in preparation of Anglo-Saxon Spring, I've been reading Kaufman's Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, in which he also references Hatcher's Albion's Seed, discussing how, just as you posited, you have to understand the hundreds of years and specifically the decades which preceded mass migration to the Americas, particularly from four Anglo groups. And how when I reflect upon that and you think about the Protestant toleration, if you will, do you think that was also supplemented by or aided by the fact that these were different Anglo groups, whether they were Presbyterian or Anglican, Congregational, they still nonetheless had a shared ethnos, right? Whether it be language, culture, custom, because one of the things you don't see amongst the Catholic French that were here and the Catholic Spanish here is they didn't want to work together. So do you think that the Anglo-Protestant notion in particular is what made this kind of Christian toleration possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was they were 97% Protestant. I think it was 75% British. So it was, significant overlap, even though you can perhaps have distinct sort of like sub-ethnicities within that and all that. They were all, of course, spoke the same language. They were all reading the same things. And so when the framers came to frame the Constitution, they'd all read the same books. And they weren't all, of course, they weren't all like books produced in England. They were like Montesquieu and other, Greek and Latin works. And so they had the same education. They were up to date on the same political philosophy that was going around. And they were generally part of the same culture, the same experience. But there were differences. I mean, it's important to note that there were regional differences. The states, the individual states were, particularly the small ones, were very serious about maintaining their own particularities and their own sovereignty, which is not just culture, but also their institutions, their laws. Because, of course, they were colonies, and then before the framing convention, they were states. And so they had their own sort of thing going for them, and they wanted to maintain that. But there were differences. But I think around the founding period and the couple decades that followed, what happened was there was an emergence of a new ethnicity, an American ethnicity. It was a ethnogenesis, and this is what actually Eric Kaufman also argues in that book you mentioned. And that was because you can reference something like John Jay and Federalist 2. You can look at George Washington's address, his farewell address near the very bottom of it, and it's this idea that Americans then had the same political principles, same ancestry generally, and more than that, they had a common struggle together. So one of the appeals from Washington, when he was finishing up his second term, and he said, "I'm done. I'm retiring. You guys, I've held this thing together for so long, and now it's your turn." His argument was that, look, we are one people, and so then over time, I think you can say then that there was even further a type of ethnogenesis, such that people would come from England. Everyone from Europe, everyone from Tocqueville to Charles Dickens would go to America, and they would say that this is a unique people. And that's what Tocqueville wrote about, and Charles Dickens famously wrote a kind of nasty sort of summary of his experience. But nevertheless, it was a different sort of people. That just, I don't really, for my purposes, the fact that Charles Dickens didn't like the Americans actually just shows that Americans were different.
And
they were their own people. So at this point, it's just kind of funny and useful. But still like Charles Dickens, by the way. But I think that's important. So there were similarities, but those similarities, given the common experience and struggle and intermarriage and common political system at the federal level, was then made it possible such that you could have a distinct people group that was American.
Yeah. Zooming in, if you will, on, again, the Protestant order, can you clear up many of the myths? You've spoken about this before, again, how Locke is seen as like an Enlightenment hero, and yet like he was pro-blasphemy laws, right? And like we mentioned before, Jefferson, everyone knows, his position on religious liberty. So we think until you realize that he enforced Sabbath laws when he was governor of Virginia. Can you clear up some of these myths, again, that religious liberty was in the context of Christianity? I mean, it's even debated during the minutes of the Constitutional Convention. The delegates from Maryland stood up and said, well, wait a second. If we're not clear about this, we can have Mohammedans and atheists run for public office. And James Madison essentially says, well, yeah, but we would never do that. Our electorate would never do that. And then, here we are with Ilhan Omar or whatever. So can you clear up some of those myths that again, people, they want to posit a religious liberty that somehow actually excludes Christianity?
Yeah, the founders would have never imagined the idea that somehow Christians would be the negative, a negative, and not even negative, that there'd be neutrality. Like they all would think, they all believed that they were, as a nation, a Christian people, even if it wasn't made official in the documents. Everyone in the 19th century believed that. Everyone in the early 20th century people believed that. Everyone in the mid 20th century believed that. And then in the 60s, something happened. Yeah. And suddenly massive loads of propaganda began to convince even Christians, and probably the majority of evangelicals today, believe that we're actually that we're a secular country, or that we shouldn't have, religion should not shape the institutions. Like evangelicals will say we're a Christian country, by which they mean we should have the proper morals. But they don't have the idea that actually Christian religion should shape and be a feature of our public institutions, right? So that's something they don't. But of course, that's how it always was. It's always how it was until very recently, and so it's a complete myth, and I think we've been At the founding period, many of the states continued to have a sort of quasi-established church until the last one was disestablished in the 1830s. And that wasn't because of a sort of liberal neutrality. These things were disestablished because they saw the religiosity of their states, which was higher than places like Europe and England or elsewhere. And the idea was, we don't really need this. We don't need to keep doing this when it's not as if we're not a religious people. And so they eventually disestablished. And when near the end of James Madison's life, he wrote a letter to, I forget who it was, but basically claiming he was right. And because one of his arguments was that if you take the government out of religion, that actually true religion will flourish. That was his argument. Now, I think he got lucky.
And look at it now.
There's just something about Anglo-Americans, which I think that's also probably a better explanation. But he was claiming victory because he said that, look, I was right, that now look at how many people are religious in these states. And we don't need an establishment, because it was the common view at the Reformation and even in American history that if you don't have a sort of state-funded religion, and you don't have an active encouragement for the people to be religious in various forms, then you're actually going to lose religion itself. And right. Madison thought he was right about that. So yeah, it's a complete myth. I mean, most people believe that they were fiercely Protestant. This is another thing I like to emphasize, the evangelicals, because they think broad terms Christian. But there was something about they viewed, and when Roman Catholics started immigrating in the mid 19th century, the great fear was that, hey, Roman Catholics are only used to tyranny because the Pope is a tyrant, and Protestantism is the religion of freedom. And so our country as a Protestant country can only survive with its liberties if we maintain its Protestant demographic and right. Protestant character. And so there was concerted effort to actually convert the Roman Catholics or Americanize them. Yeah. And one of those was to become Protestant. And that wasn't irrational. I mean, even though I think it was irrational in a sense that most Roman Catholics really don't care about what the Pope says. It wasn't without some warrant, because it was true that the Pope, we tend to think nowadays like Vatican II, religious liberty, blah, 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 blah. But that was not the stated policy of the Roman Church throughout the 19th century, was that he could depose heretics, and he could subvert states that were against the church or don't want to recognize the church. There was an issue. I mean, there's still memory of the founding of Maryland as a colony, right, where there was huge issues over loyalty questions. Well, the King of England wanted a loyalty test, but if you swear loyalty to the king, then you can't swear loyalty to the Pope. And there's all these problems, and people just tend to forget that and think it was like anti-Catholic bigotry, when it really there was actually a history that could support that sort of thing. But anyway.
Well, you bring up a great point, because, again, to really emphasize that the American ethnos was Protestant, I mean, well into the 20th century, there were migration quotas, not against all the colored people of the world, as a leftist would want you to believe, though that was included, but no, specifically targeting Catholics, essentially. We were suspicious of the Irish Catholics and the Italian Catholics, which you have no explanation for apart from a Protestant America. But that being said, you're given a time machine and you can go back. What were some things you would have done differently with respect to the founding era that could have solidified our American Protestant nation? Like what should they have done different? Because like the theonomic crowd, for example, would say, oh, well, we should have been more explicit in our laws from the Bible, or other initiatives thereof to encourage Protestant Christianity. What would you have done differently to solidify American Protestantism?
Well, I think, Christ should be in the Constitution, particularly in the preamble. There should be a recognition that we're a Christian people, a recognition of Christ as King of Kings. So I think that's that. But at the same time, that it by itself doesn't secure a political order. This is why I'm right. I've emphasized in my book and elsewhere that to be a Christian nation, it's not that you say you are, right? It's that you do Christian things. Like a nation. That's why in my definition, it's a matter of of Christian nationalists, it's a matter of like action. It's like the things that you do. And because you can declare, it's like an individual who declares he's Christian, but he doesn't act as such. He doesn't attend church or pray or anything like that. And so the same thing with like a nation, is that being a Christian nation is a nation that does things, that does Christian things.
You can just do things. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it was the founding. I mean, I don't know. That's interesting. Like, apart from what I already said, I don't know if anything with regard to religion needed to change. Because again, these guys, I think even in the disestablishment, I don't agree with all the disestablishments, but I do think they were inheriting a religious liberty tradition from their Protestant forefathers. And it was actually good. It was good that we could have a functioning political order in which different Protestants could get along. Like that, that sounds good. And the reason why you wouldn't want to do that is that it wouldn't work as a political order, but for the Americans, it did, right? So I think what would it be is that, frankly, don't allow Roman Catholic immigration. All the way back to the mid-19th century. You have someone like Charles, I think it was Charles Hodge, was complaining around that time that he was complaining about immigration because the Anglo-Saxon people, to his mind, were Sabbath-keeping people. And the question of the Sabbath and like the postal office and all that sort of thing was a big question that in these times. And the fear among Charles Hodge was that, well, you bring all these people in who don't recognize Sabbath keeping, and you flood them with your communities, and then that goes away, which is generally speaking in Roman Catholic communities, they don't follow the Sabbath. So I think that was that's one element. Of course, I think that was a big mistake. And to this day, I mean, nearly half of Roman Catholics vote for the Democrats, sometimes even a lot more than that. And so, I mean, among like white Roman Catholics, are about half. And then you have the others who are Roman Catholic by name, but they vote ethnically. So, but anyway, so, and perhaps so do the Roman Catholics. That's another question. But yeah, I think that was like a mistake. And even in the progressive era, when you start getting more of this type of multicultural thinking, people say that, it was like wokeism, or that stuff that happened in the progressive era was like a Protestant thing, Anglo-Protestant thing. But that is true to an extent. But a lot of the people, like in New York City, what they would witness like the workhouses of these immigrants, and they'd say, this is atrocious, this shouldn't be. And so they start doing progressive era type multiculturalist thinking, because now you have these, white man burdened sort of Anglo-Protestants looking at these, a lot of them Unitarians.
Yep.
And looking at these people. And so that's when this stuff kicks off in the 20s and 30s. And you can see how there's a sort of decline of the relevance of Protestantism going in the 50s and 60s, because they basically just let themselves get taken over. And so all the academic institutions were crowded now with communists and non-Christians. And so, yeah.
Well, and so it's fascinating.
You never know how history would have gone, right? You say change this. It's like saying, that like if you know one thing, the King of England is the defender of the faith, right? King Charles now is a defender of the faith. Like, well, is he?
Right, exactly. He's not really defending a whole lot.
It's hard to know, like, if we did something like that, if now we'd still be Christian. But so it's really difficult. But I do think there were mistakes made along the way, and so.
Well, and perhaps that was the weakness of the question, because to your point, it's not as if we could have gone back, just fixed one thing and it was all okay. And that's apparent in your definition for Christian nationalism, that it's a totality of national action, not merely laws, but social customs. You talk about, like, guys, just advocating for, the Christmas pageant for our kids at school, right? Or for national days of prayer, a totality of national action that is inherently Christian. And that's something I think we'll get into when we talk about looking forward, because you're right, we can't armchair quarterback the past, but perhaps in identifying the mistakes of the past, we can develop solid provisions for the future. So with that being said, here's the scenario. Congress passes a resolution, like you had mentioned, that Christ really is king over America. He's the King of Kings. We confess the Apostles' Creed. It's shortly after the preamble. And what now? How would various denominations relate to one another? And I think this will get really interesting. What do we do with apostates? Because I think even in the historical phenomena you just described, what made this very difficult to maintain a Christian America was the fact we had so much rampant heresy that was promoted at the mainline level, the institutional level. So, how should various in the in the new Christian America, how should denominations relate to one another, and how do we handle apostasy?
Yeah, great question. So if what you're describing occurs, then that means there's widespread national support for it, and we're declaring that that's going to be our, call it a social dogma. That's going to be the social dogma.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Okay. I've been beating up on social dogma over the last few weeks, but that's only because I think it's false dogma.
Right. For now.
Yeah, and so I do think, yeah, you have the people, broadly speaking, have a sense of what is right and wrong, and they have sentiments toward it. And so if we're going to, if there's the will and the sentiment to establish that kind of Christian order, then it's going to be very natural for us to try to suppress certain people who are apostates or non-Christians, but not in the sense that they can't have the freedom to live, freedom to like live their lives. That doesn't mean we bulldoze the synagogues or the mosques or anything like that. But it does mean that ordinarily in our institutions, it would be a Christian institution, and ordinarily you'd have Christians in charge of this institution. So if it's a state school or a state university, if you have government and various agencies, the demand would be that they are on board with the social dogma, which is we are a Christian people. And if someone freaks out about that and they say, that's not American, we shouldn't do that, we can't demand people to do that. Well, actually, we do that sort of thing all the time.
Right.
If you discover that if like just recently, there was it FBI, I think, that someone is going to get appointed to the FBI, and it turns out that they're not a fan of Israel.
Yep.
This person. And so this person's appointment was rescinded.
Yep.
Now, if it turns out the guy's not a fan of Christianity, I bet that he'd probably still get in there, right?
Right.
So there is a social dogma. There are standards. Just it happens to be that if you don't care for Israel, or if you think that turning Gaza into a bunch of rubble is actually bad, and you said so, then you likely will not get appointment to the federal government. So that is actually a standard. Yeah. If it turns out this guy's in a group chat and he shared some spicy memes that are racial, he probably won't get the job, right? It turns out that he's in an atheist group where they discuss matters, and he said things that are not nice to Christian, or I don't know. He just disagrees with certain Christian doctrines or something. He'd probably still get the job. No one will make a big deal about it. It's like when, I hate to bring him up again, but like Doug Wilson will have a nice jovial discussion with Christopher Hitchens for several sessions.
All documentary. Yep.
And all this stuff, and have a documentary, and they're laughing and drinking beer together. He's an atheist. I mean, he's also a liberal. I mean, he did have certain, like he was against abortion in certain ways and all that stuff. But he was a solid liberal, secularist atheist. Probably a decent guy to talk to, just like most people who are deviants today are pretty decent guys if you get to meet them. But yet you see the various, if you see the various ways that Doug has now
interacted
with the anti-Semites and the ethno people and all that, or what do you call them, ethnotards, and today on Twitter, very different. So, okay, but that's what I'm talking about. Is there is a social dogma? You enforce it, not you, but I'm saying you watching, or typically you don't like me. You are an active enforcers of the social dogma. So don't tell me, oh, that's un-American, that's bad, this blah blah blah. No, you do the same thing. I'm just saying, okay, if you're willing to, the guy who says something racist, if you're willing to join in to have this guy lose his job, why not have a Christian order in which Christianity as a public norm is that thing as well? Wouldn't that be good?
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, Joel Berry would be a whole lot nicer to people. But that being said, from the social dogma aspect to even the legal framework, I think, again, our past holds a lot of the answers. Beeson v. Davis in 1890 was a SCOTUS case dealing with a Mormon who wanted a gajillion wives. And the decision was made like, no, just because quote unquote religious toleration, religious freedom, you cannot do things outwardly that are disruptive to the social order. And in that decision, they cited many laws from New England and southern states, which had specifically made provisions with respect to religious toleration that you can have the synagogue, you can have the mosque, but not such that the social order is disrupted, that it's chaotic. And like you detail in your book, that was informed by, crazy Quakers in the New England era. And I think that informs us going forward because as much as I don't necessarily get along with Pentecostals and the way that they worship, so long as they're not outwardly disturbing the social order, they can have that practice. Because I think if we're not careful, we can have the MacArthurites of the world and the other truly reformed who are now going to headhunt every other Christian tradition in the new Christian America if we don't have a, I guess, more broad understanding of what was the American Protestant tradition dealing with these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So and that's what I try to emphasize, that these guys in the founding 19th century, they inherited a tradition, and it was just natural for them to extend toleration to different Protestant groups. It didn't seem like a big deal. In fact, it seemed deeply wrong to start, suppressing different groups. But at the same time, this is what people have realized, they still affirm that their liberties were Protestant liberties, and that Protestantism was essential to, as it sort of undergirding those liberties. You lose Protestantism, you lose the liberties.
Right.
But now, yeah, you're right. Now you have people who I think ahistorically want to, like you say, like MacArthur and others, who want to kind of denounce everyone, like attack various other denominations. I mean, it's fine to do that as a theological thing.
Correct. Yeah. Different spheres.
But I actually don't think they're the problem, though. I think the problem will be many Baptists and it's across the board, but Baptists have a stronger claim to a sort of religious liberty tradition. And this is the difficulty with the Baptists. There are many Baptists who are, they want a Christian public order, but it's so fused with it's a moral order. It's like the old moral majority of, like, we want traditional American, like, family values, and we want to end abortion, and we want to end this and that. And it's fused with that. That's what to be a Christian order is, but it's not more than that. It's not
right. It's not institutionalized.
It's not institutionalized, exactly. And so, and Baptists, to me, I say Baptist. I don't mean there are many Baptists who are on, our side, but
right. Evangelicals at large in America.
Yeah, but the loudest ones tend to be the ones that say, I'm Baptist, so I'm pro religious liberty, which basically means license.
Right.
It just means you can do anything you want. And so you have this, like, the lowest common denominator of morality, which is basically procedural liberalism. So you get modern liberalism. Like, this is the thing about I keep being Baptist, but I don't know if you're Baptist or not, actually.
No. I grew up Southern Baptist, but by God's grace, I'm a Presbyterian, so it's all good.
See, the Baptists, like, they like to claim a tradition of religious liberty, and there is some truth to that. I'm not doubting that. But their experience in this country, being those advocates and then seeing basically wins on that front, have always been in the context of a Christian culture,
right?
Of a Christian heritage, Christian tradition, one that was pro-Christianity. But the natural result of that, especially sort of the maximal religious liberty, where this extends far beyond just Christian groups, means that it's contradictory. Like, it's a contradictory thing, because then it undermines the very basis of religious liberty itself, which was a Christian Protestant culture. And so that's kind of the problem. So now Baptists find themselves in a situation where they're free to do whatever they want, but now everyone else is as well. And so it actually undermines the Christian character of the country entirely. So
do you think
and I think in the long run, religious liberty, I mean, we have constitutional safeguards, but yeah, the people who like to their bones like feel religious liberty are basically historical, Americans,
Right.
what we call heritage Americans or whatever you want to
Right.
call them. They're the ones who feel the moral principles to their bones, whereas many of the other people simply want to instrumentalize these liberties for their own actual group preferences. So it's not like a
Right.
universal principle they hold. It's instrumentalized liberty.
Well, Gary North, for example, blamed pretty much everything on Roger Williams, so I have no problem doing that either. But do you think, working out the scenario, we have a new Christian America, and Protestants now have to figure out how we're going to make this thing work with respect to handling apostasy? There's even in the 1689, there are essentially provisions or principles there where, again, the magistrate can have some degree of enforcement of dealing with apostasy, of dealing with heresy. Do you think in the scenario, the Apostles' Creed became essentially federally acknowledged? Do you think that that would help, for example, delineating between, again, these crazy charismatic Pentecostals, they're speaking in tongues and they're dancing around. Well, the government is not going to step in to do that. But if they deny the Trinity, well, then the magistrate has the right to then step in. Like, how do you flesh that out essentially of what would the Christian prince, the magistrate, in this scenario, what would that look like handling other denominations?
Yeah, this is where I would kind of disagree with some of my more covenanter friends of the moderate and the more extreme sort. My fundamental principle is the safety of the people. And when it comes to people who would deny Trinitarian doctrine, you would want that to be, to use an old word, like discountenanced. Like you'd want to look upon it with disfavor and discouraged. And hopefully the general public would do that as well. But if they affirm that in such a way that it's not disruptive of the social order, that they still support a general broad Christian character of the country, Christian morality, Christian laws, if they're not subversives of Sabbath keeping, if they're not socially publicly disruptive, I think liberty can be extended to them. I think in the American context. So again, people have to realize that if we were in Puritan New England right now, if we were in Boston and a bunch of Pentecostal anti-Trinitarians showed up to Boston, they'd be banished.
Right.
Because in that context, that was a smaller group of united belief who, because of their homogeneity, both culturally and theologically, they had a robust project oriented around that. And so when you show up with a bunch of divergent beliefs, this is the Baptist. This is what the Baptists did to Boston. Then I think they have a right to say, you either get along with us and conform or you're out.
Right.
And so same with them. But yeah, I think in American context, I don't think the magistrate should just kind of go around and find heresy and begin using law to suppress it, unless these people are subversive. But again, the Pentecostals nowadays, they're the ones who are, in terms of Christian nationalist label, they're the biggest group. I've never actually interacted with them, strangely.
Yeah.
But so I don't know.
Yeah, they're the ones. They're the ones in the White House faith office or whatever. So, I mean, see, subversion's an interesting aspect because it's almost, unfortunately, one of those things that the frog has to start boiling before you realize, oh, we've been subverted. I think the Unitarians are a great example, where even John Adams, many would argue, was a Unitarian, and they did quote unquote good for a time in New England. But I would also argue, similarly to Pastor Zach Garris, that like the Unitarians virtually destroyed much of what we loved about America. But then not only handling them, because at least they were Christian in name, though theologically they weren't. If we can't handle them right, there's a part of me that asks, well, then how do we handle Jews, Muslims, Hindus? Because apparently there's a ton of them in government now, right? I think these are questions we have to flesh out, because otherwise we don't have a standard in a new Christian America of, well, why not have Vivek Ramaswamy, do everything for us, kind of a thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing about, it's really about any minority group, whether it's religious or ethnic or whatever it is. The minority groups always tend to want to make their position equal with the majority,
Right.
because they are outsiders. And a good example of this is the Presbyterians in Virginia in the founding period, and before that, they were a minority group surrounded by Anglicans, and they were the fiercest advocates for a very expanded notion of religious liberty. And that's where the American version of the Westminster Confession comes from that minority experience as Presbyterians among Anglicans. And so really any minority group can be subversive to the majority, and historically that's been the case. And but even apart from religion, if you just have a different ethnic group that's a minority, if you have a sort of excessively open majority, it's easy for the minority then to sort of subvert that.
Right.
Because someone like Vivek, like as a sort of, I think he was actually an anchor baby, actually. That's what I heard.
Color me shocked.
His position within American society is based upon a sort of openness that he has an interest in that. Minorities have an interest in that. And so he's going to advocate for that. And when you advocate for openness, that means that you're essentially downgrading the majority's claim to the homeland.
Right.
And Western Europeans are immensely susceptible to that, as we've seen. That's not true for everyone. It is true for English. It's true for the Scottish. It's true for Americans. It's true for Western Europeans, particularly among Anglo Protestants. It's been very serious. It's true for the French, but probably a little less so, and certainly for the Germans for their own reasons. But if you look in Eastern Europe, Romania has a sizable population of Hungarians, and guess what? Those Hungarians, they're second class. I mean, they're not Romanian. So the Romanians have a strong claim to Romania against the Hungarians so they can live with that status because Romanians have a strong will for themselves in their own country.
Right.
Same thing with the Hungarians and elsewhere, where they have that sort of majority-minority dynamic. But yeah, in America and Western Europe, it's essentially the majorities are being replaced and dispossessed, because one, they have notions of universality, they have notions of openness that then open up their country to the very people whose self-interest is to perpetuate that. So I've said before that every minority you bring in, you have one, but then generations of people who are going to advocate for further openness. Like literally you bring in immigrants and they're going to typically advocate for immigration because their very status in the country depends upon that openness.
Right.
I think that's been true since World War II. But as you said, since the 1920s up until the Immigration Act of 1965, there was massive, very strict immigration rules. But 1965 just opened up the floodgates, and we're dealing with it today.
With respect to, I guess, closing the discussion on a new Christian America, do you think ultimately one of the most powerful things that could be done, one of the most long-lasting things that could be done that really settles a lot of this conversation would be ridding ourselves of Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution with religious test oaths? Like, would you, in your vision of a new Christian America, would public officials have to affirm a religious test oath? Because there were plenty of laws governing such in the founding era amongst several states where you had to be a Protestant Christian to hold office.
So people would expect me to say absolutely yes.
Yep.
Right. So I think my answer is yes, but I'm also not 100% convinced that it matters one way or the other.
Well, as given you explained really before that, again, it's more so concerned about action than that. Yeah, no, it's that because they have that in the Constitution, and it was debated a lot. It was one of those things where they proposed states proposed to remove that, but it was left in there largely because they didn't want to change anything because it was barely passed from the get-go. Like they can have another framing convention and barely pass this new one. So that's why they didn't want to change anything. But there were a lot of groups that did want that changed.
And I do think that was a mistake, but I think at that time, it would be less relevant than perhaps in our day to day. So I think if we were to establish, in the coming decades, a Christian American republic with the things we've talked about already, I think it'd be wise to put that in there, just given our own experience, right? Given our own experience. But one person, Oliver Ellsworth, was a Connecticut delegate to the framing convention, and he wrote a piece defending the religious test. And he said that basically we have diversity of opinion, but also it doesn't matter because people just lie.
Yeah, he did say it. Yeah,
And he also said, but he did say that you can suppress blasphemy and impiety and stuff like that. So that wasn't precluded. Like, he's not saying that it's wrong to suppress like atheism and perhaps polytheism and other things. But yeah, I guess that's a long-winded answer. But I guess the answer is yes. But I just am not 100% confident that is like the key.
Correct.
To it all.
Well, do you think this would help? Because part of the question with the scenario is, what would the balance of power between the federal government and state governments look like? Because perhaps this is an issue that the states could determine for themselves. I think, and perhaps you'd agree, I think 1865 didn't deal very, very well with that question of states' rights. So do you think in a new Christian America, states would have more hold of not only these questions, but other ones in solidifying themselves as Christian states?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I mean, this is really where religion should be anyway. It should be in the states. I think Christians have missed that for a long time. And really the Constitution with the First Amendment, that's really what the intent was, that the more specific forms of Christianity would be matters for the states, and they had the rights to enforce certain religious laws. And I do think the federal government certainly has a right to encourage through various means, Christian religiosity. But the First Amendment does restrict that. But yeah, it should be in the states. And I think that a lot of these Warren Court decisions regarding religion and the states are unconstitutional. And I think the state governors should resist those. Like they should not feel bound by things that are unconstitutional, that are blatantly unconstitutional. So they have to, there has to be prudence and there has to be wisdom in this. But yeah, I think it should be in the states, and federalism should be maintained. And really, I just would hope people would actually be. We're so consumed with national politics for good reason, but I wish that we were actually more focused on the states, because in ways the states, you don't see it, but the state actually dictates a lot more of your life than the federal government. Like, people don't really realize that, but the laws all around me in this room, the reason why it was built this way, and hopefully it was an inspector did his job and inspected this house well, that's all state laws and some county laws. So anyway, but yes.
But as a curveball, which completely undermines that question, because that question is is rooted in federalism. That question was, this undermines it, is there does appear amongst dissident right fanboys, a draw, an appeal, an allure to either monarchy or oligarchy. What would you say to those things? I think, knowing you and having read plenty of your work, I think you would say that even if those are permissible forms of government, I think you would argue that those are not natural to our American experience and would probably not be prudent for that reason.
Yeah, I think that is true. I do have good friends who are basically monarchists, and I respect that position. It's just something I haven't thought about a whole lot, because I just don't see it as
possible
in the American context. I mean, it does say in the Constitution that if you're going to be a state, you have to have a Republican form of government. And so we'd have to get rid of that. And we'd have to get the states to change their constitutions towards monarchy. But I understand the argument. I don't think all the arguments for monarchy are actually that good. But
yeah, they're not equal. They're not created equal.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones that they use, like, look at the CEO of Apple. Like, you need a CEO. CEOs are the ones who shape great businesses, and they always, you always have to have a single guy who's in charge, which is, I think, disanalogous to political order. But anyway,
Right.
that's I haven't thought a lot about it, I guess, is the answer. But the reason is that I just don't see it as something Americans are going to adopt anytime soon.
Right. Or in the words of Roosevelt, it's not a realizable ideal. It's not attainable or obtainable,
Yeah.
perhaps. But I have certainly taken up too much of your time. I'll close with a couple of questions that are really applicational for listeners, many of whom are more than familiar with your work, but if they're not, at least they can hear it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. What are some ways, and your podcast covers this all the time, what are some ways that Christians can participate in the pursuit of the next Protestant order? How can we improve our approach to culture? And what are your biggest resource recommendations apart from your own wonderful book?
Yeah, I don't want to be a nuanced guy here, but I mean, so much of it depends on your station in life, your stage of life, and on what to do. I mean, one thing that is a general duty, and that's universal, is that, of course, you belong to a great church. You attend worship twice on Sunday, or or once at the very least, and you're active in the church in that regard. That you ensure that your family is a Christian family, you do Christian things as a family. That and also, I mean, for younger guys, I would say, like, there's a thing about being young, and there's a thrill of being transgressive. And if you're 18, 20, 25, maybe I'm talking about this, but I would just say that a lot of people should just kind of lay low. Like, you don't need to do what I do. You can be an anonymous guy online.
Whoa.
Yeah. And, be careful with yourself, of course, when doing that. And, but yeah, this is what the left did, which is they got people in power. They got people in positions. They rose up in the ranks. So I think that just like your day will come, and right now, just don't destroy those prospects. Now, if you are a very gifted 20-something-year-old, and you're going to go into media, and you're going to get a YouTube channel that gets 1 million followers, and you're going to be a Christian national or whatever, then go for it. Like, that's great. I'm just saying, for most people, it's probably best not to kind of destroy certain possibilities. Like, take myself. I'm a part of certain institutions in my community, but in a way, it's sort of fragile, right? I could damage them or damage myself. It's all sorts of things, right? So people think I'm not doing anything, but I am doing a lot of stuff. So because of who I am and what I've said in the past, it's made it so there are doors that are shut. So
Right.
I've got a role, you've got a role, and all that sort of thing. So I think there's all sorts of things I could mention. Oh, some resources. I mean, the things that American Reformer is doing is great. So I would definitely support and follow them. If you're a younger guy, look at the Cotton Mather Fellowship. Look that up. So those are good. I think, to keep it short, those are some good resources. Did I cover all your questions? I can't remember if I...
Yeah, that's good enough. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I would refer people to, of course, not just your book, but also your podcasts and all the other neat things you're getting lined up with New Christendom Press, which is like the best thing, the best combination since, peanut butter and jelly. I'm looking forward to that for sure.
Yeah, let me mention also my Logic series.
Yes, I was going to give it a shout out. I'm literally a student of yours. So yeah, I was going to give it a shout out.
On Patreon right now. It's going to shift over to Supercast, which is the thing that New Christendom is using. It's going to be the same thing. I'm doing a weekly logic class, going through traditional logic now. If you stick with it, there'll be dozens and dozens of lectures on different courses on there over time. I just do one a week. I can't do more than that. And right now we're in course 2 on traditional logic. We'll move into material logic, and then maybe do some advanced logic, maybe do Aristotle, maybe do stuff. I try to make it as simple as possible and as short as possible for the working fellow. So check that out.
Yeah, I could testify as, an unpaid testimonial. No, it's great, folks. If you grew up with a Louisiana education like me and didn't know that you could study logic, it is approachable and challenging, super informative. And if you're a seminarian or a college student like myself, you get a discounted price. So it's totally worth it. It is the kind of logic that, for whatever reason, a lot of people hate. Apparently, if you're doing it, it's pagan thought. It's evil. It's wicked.
Aristotle. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Of
See,
course, all those guys are using it. They just don't know it, and often poorly. That's the problem.
I will warn folks, if you take the course, you will begin to get frustrated with people when they cannot put their thoughts into a syllogism. But apart from that, there are no other side effects or symptoms. I think in terms of recommendations, I'll probably plug at the end of this episode the video that somebody made of the Do the Reading song. Doing the reading in any of these topics really does transform your view on things. To simply ask, what has the church, what did the founding fathers, what did they think of these things? Who are they reading? You might arrive at a frustrated place because everyone likes to claim that they know what these guys' ideas were, but then you find out, oh, actually, they have no idea what these guys were, or at least they're not really giving a fair shake. But I digress. That's a whole nother conversation. But Dr. Wolfe, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this discussion. I think it's going to be a lot of fun for a lot of folks. Can you tell people again, besides your Patreon, that's soon to be a Supercast, where people can find you, find your work?
Let's see. Yeah, so the Lone Bulwark on YouTube, and then on Twitter, just search Stephen Wolfe. I'm the guy, standing with my arms crossed. You'll see me. And let's see. I guess that's it. I mean, there is the new Ars Politica is coming back. That's my old podcast with my friend Thomas, and we're actually recording right now. I gotta go. I'm
all right. Well,
he's probably texting me like, "We're there."
Yeah, I will certainly let you go. Thank you so much again for your time, folks. This has been Politica Christiana. We pray that thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And Lord, help us to meet it. Until next time, may God bless you, your family, this nation. May Christ have his crown rights. Go forth, crush the serpent, take dominion, and make disciples. Thank you, guys. And with that, folks, season 1 is over. I want to give a special thanks to all our guests who helped us build this season, from state representatives to journalists to everyday Christian brothers. It's been our hope to introduce you all to Christian politics, and next season, we'll progress from understanding to application. The greatest gratitude goes to you, dear listener, who has been with us since day one. Your support helps us keep up the fight against the lies of our age, so please continue to like and share our content. The Navy will have all of my time again for the next couple months, but be on the lookout for more content on our social media platforms, specifically Instagram and X. May God bless you, our families, and our nation.